What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be going through my Week 5 wide receiver rankings going into the weekend. And obviously, this is the first week here where we have some bye weeks. So certainly some things to consider as far as start-sit decisions. Hopefully, today's video helps you guys with some of those decisions as we get into the weekend. But without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I got 7 tiers pulled up on the screen today to get through all 36 wide receivers in our rankings. Now, the label on the left side of the screen is how I'm going to be viewing these players as we put them into our lineup. So the guys at the top are obviously those elite wide receiver ones. You don't have to worry about them this week. And the guys down at the bottom are more so low-end wide receiver 3s. But let's just hop into the first tier. The first tier for me is going to have 3 players: Amon-Ra, St. Brown, Puka, Nacua, and Jaxon, Smith-Njigba. That is the entire tier for me. All of these guys are seeing insane volume, just very highly productive fantasy football wide receivers so far throughout the year. Amon-Ra gets a matchup against Cincinnati. Have no worries about that defense for Amon-Ra. And then there's some tougher matchups based on fantasy points allowed for Puka, Nacua, and JSN, but the volume, it's going to trump everything for me. So even though, like I said, tough matchups against the San Francisco 49ers for the Rams and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for the Seattle Seahawks, I am not worried about these two players. They are PPR monsters. Now, my next tier is going to be those high-end wide receiver ones. I have a total of 5 guys in this tier. Kicking it off, number 4, it's Garrett Wilson, followed by Jefferson, Nico, Davante Adams, and Emeka Egbuka. That is my entire tier here. A couple matchups that I want to talk about. The first one's going to be Garrett Wilson. He gets a good matchup against the Dallas Cowboys, who currently ranked dead last against fantasy wide receivers so far this year, giving up 44.2 fantasy points per game. He should be a fine play this week against the Cowboys. Nico gets a good matchup as well against the Baltimore Ravens. It's on the road in Baltimore. There should be no Lamar Jackson in this game. That defense has given up the 28th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far this year, currently giving up 32.9 fantasy points per game. Should be a good spot for Nico to get a little bit more involved and give us potentially a spike week here in week 5. Adams gets another tough matchup this week, just like I said with Puka against the San Francisco 49ers. But this offense here in Los Angeles, I am not worried about them. As you can tell, Puka and Davante Adams are both top 7 plays for me on the week. And Emeka Egbuka gets a tough matchup against Seattle, who is currently the second best ranked defense against the wide receiver position. It's going to be no Mike Evans in this game. Chris Godwin is still certainly working his way back from that injury. Emeka Egbuka is the receiving part of this offense. I think he's still a top 8 play, and he's becoming a little bit matchup proof already as a rookie. So still no worries for him despite the tough matchup against Seattle. Now, moving on to my next tier, these are the low-end wide receiver ones, and it's a little bit of a bigger tier here. I have 7 players to make up the entire tier. It's going to be George Pickens at 9, Jamar Chase at 10, Michael Pittman at 11, 12 is Quentin, Johnston, Courtland, Sutton at 13. I got Tetairoa, McMillan at 14. And my last player is going to be Zay Flowers at 15. This is kind of what happens when you have bye weeks. You have guys that you would not even consider to be top 12 options that are top 12 options. I'm looking at you, Michael Pittman Jr. and Quentin Johnston. But hey, the production has been there for those guys. And when I look at those 2 players in particular, Michael Pittman has one of the better matchups for wide receivers this week going against the Las Vegas Raiders. They are currently ranked 30th against the position, giving up 34.8 fantasy points per game. So that's why he slides up here into my top 12. And the same thing with Quentin Johnston, a good matchup against the Washington Commanders, who are currently ranked 25th against the wide receiver position, giving up 31.1 fantasy points per game to that position group. So both of these guys, it feels weird. You look at it and you're probably like, this guy is crazy, but these are top 12 plays for me this week. I wish I could get Jamar Chase a little bit lower, but with the buys, I can't get him that much lower, and still feels like he has big game potential, even if Jake Browning is playing horribly. And honestly, I'm having a hard time sitting him still regardless. So really outside of that, I don't think there's too much to talk about in this tier. We kind of know what we're getting with most of these guys so far. I need to see a little bit of a better week from Jamar Chase, but hopefully that comes against the Detroit Lions. It's a little bit of a tougher defense as well, so maybe it won't. Let's go to the next tier. The next tier is going to be that high-end wide receiver 2 tier for me. I got a total of 5 players in this tier. Coming in at 16, it's going to be Jalen Waddle, 17, Deebo Samuel, 18, Keenan Allen, 19, AJ Brown, and then 20, Marvin Harrison Jr. This is a very interesting tier tier of players, in my opinion. There's plenty of tough matchups, a couple of good ones. We can talk about all of these guys. I think it's worth doing so. Jalen Waddle at 16, he plays on the road at the Carolina Panthers. It is a tough matchup on paper. Carolina is third best against the wide receiver position so far this year, giving up 19.7 fantasy points per game. But he's going to be filling in as the wide receiver 1 here in Miami moving forward for Tyreek Hill, who has obviously suffered that season-ending injury. I think Jalen Waddle is a player that volume is going to come his way, and he's going to be very interesting moving forward, even if this week's matchup is a little bit tougher on paper. Deebo Samuel's another player who has a tough matchup in this tier. He's playing on the road at the Los Angeles Chargers. They are a top 5 team against wide receivers, only allowing 20.5 fantasy points per game to that group, and he is probably going to be filling in as the wide receiver 1 again this week for an injured Terry McLaurin, but obviously Wednesdays are the injury report days, so we will get some more information today and as the week goes on about Terry McLaurin. Keenan Allen, he gets the same good matchup that I talked about for Quentin Johnston. He seems to be operating as the wide receiver 2, and Ladd McConkey seems to be operating as the wide receiver 3. So for now, that's how I'm going to operate with these guys in my rankings. You see QJ1, Keenan Allen 2 in that offense, but this should be a pretty decent matchup for Keenan Allen again, who does seem to be a security blanket for Justin Herbert. AJ Brown is a player we can talk about with a very tough matchup against Denver and Pat Surtain. Right now, Denver is the 4th best defense against fantasy wide receivers, and the Philadelphia Eagles just do not pass the football enough for me to feel comfortable with AJ. He is now floating in that, fringe wide receiver 2 territory for me as my wide receiver 19 this week, but he is closer to that low-end wide receiver 2 than he is a low-end wide receiver 1 these days. So I'm sorry for anybody who has AJ Brown at this point in time. I feel you because I have him in a couple of dynasty leagues, but man, it has been tough sledding for AJ Brown, and I don't think it necessarily gets better this week. Marvin Harrison is the last player that I want to talk about. It's a good matchup for him against the Tennessee Titans. They are currently ranked 27th against the wide receiver position, giving up 32.3 fantasy points per game to that group. He had a little bit of a better second half last week. You saw him get emotional when he caught the touchdown. Hopefully that, kind of snowballs here into this week. But for now, I'm still viewing him as a high-end wide receiver 2 in my rankings. Let's go to tier 5. Tier 5 has 5 players that we can talk about. These are the low-end wide receiver 2s, and starting it off as my wide receiver 21, it's Jacoby Myers, followed by Chris Olave, Ladd McConkey, Jamison Williams, and then Xavier Worthy to round out the top 25. A lot of good matchups in this tier. I just don't think these players have immense ceilings for fantasy purposes this week. Jacoby Myers has a good matchup against the Colts on the road. Right now, they're ranked 29th against wide receivers, giving up 34.5 fantasy points per game, so he should be a safe option as a wide receiver 2 play. Chris Olave is kind of the same thing against the New York Giants. This one's going to be at home for the New Orleans Saints. They're 31st against the wide receiver position right now, giving up 35 fantasy points per game, and so I think Chris Olave also another safe wide receiver play, but probably doesn't have the ceiling based on the offense. That's kind of the same thing with Jacoby Myers. The other guy who has a good matchup, we talked about it with Keenan and Quentin Johnston, is Ladd McConkey, but Ladd McConkey has kind of disappeared a little bit. I'm not worried about him, season long, but this is not the volume that we wanted out of Ladd McConkey that we were getting last year, and that is hurting his upside. This offense is unpredictable. Every week, somebody's getting a little bit more targets, whether that go to QJ, whether he catches the touchdown or goes to Keenan Allen. None of them has gone Ladd McConkey's way yet so far. His days will come, but until we start seeing a little bit more signs of life, we have to temper the expectations with him in fantasy, and that's why he comes in for me as a low-end wide receiver 2 play in a good offense that has the ability to boom each and every week. So let's go to tier 6 here. Tier 6 for me is going to be those high-end wide receiver 3s. I got a total of 6 players in this tier. I'm starting it off at 26 with Wan'Dale Robinson. I got Stephon Diggs at 27, 28 Brian Thomas Jr., 29 Devontae Smith, 30 Khalil Shakir, and 31 Jordan Addison. 3 players specifically we should talk about. Wan'Dale Robinson is the first one on the road at the New Orleans Saints. Going to be filling in for Neighbors with this injury that he suffered that's going to keep him out for the remainder of the year. Darius Slayton's another guy to keep an eye on. I don't have Darius Slayton in my top 36. I think Wan'Dale Robinson is the better fantasy football option because he's going to be a little bit more of a PPR merchant than he is, a little bit unreliable like Darius Slayton, who's going to need some big plays to potentially hit your lineups. But those are going to happen for the New York Giants. I just think Wan'Dale Robinson is the safer play this week and I think he's probably the safer play long term. So he comes in at 26 for me. We'll see what happens with Jaxon Dart and this offense now that Neighbors is no longer in it. Bryant Thomas Jr. is another player I want to talk about. It hasn't been a good year for him. He plays versus the Kansas City Chiefs on Monday Night Football. It is a tough matchup. They have been top 8 against fantasy football wide receivers, only allowing 22.8 fantasy points per game. Unfortunately, this is just not a spot where I'm comfortable with Bryant Thomas Jr., and we haven't seen enough from him and or Travis Hunter. We just haven't seen enough from the receiving game in Jacksonville for me to feel very comfortable about anybody moving forward. Devonta Smith is another player I'll talk about. A tough matchup against Denver. Like I said with A.J. Brown, you got Pat Surtain. He probably will shadow A.J. Brown for the majority of the day. That should maybe be a little bit better news for Devonta Smith, but still, this is an offense, like I said, that does not pass the ball enough for people to be very reliable in the receiving game. And you saw weeks like last week where Dallas Goedert is the guy catching the 2 touchdowns. So it's just going to be unpredictable. Devonta Smith, not very reliable, but obviously a boom bust option here as a high-end wide receiver 3. Now moving on to my final tier here in tier 7 to round out my top 36, I got 5 guys. Going to be Juwan Jennings, T. Higgins, Keon Coleman, Alec Iamaner, and Troy Franklin. And this is really where you start seeing the bye weeks take effect in the rankings, because these guys typically aren't cracking my top 36. Maybe they will moving forward if we get some good weeks, but Juwan Jennings is really the only player I want to talk about in depth in this tier. He plays on Thursday Night Football. He's currently questionable with an ankle injury. Pearsall has a knee injury. So if Jennings plays, which it seems like he's closer to trending towards playing than Pearsall is, I would expect Jennings to potentially play, Pearsall to be out in this matchup. If that is the case, this is still a little bit of a tougher matchup against the Los Angeles Rams, but Juwan Jennings should be one of the remaining options here in San Francisco. It's TBD as well with Brock Purdy. Is Brock Purdy going to be under center? Like I said, Wednesdays are the injury news days, so hopefully we get a little bit more clarity, but at the time of this recording, we don't have a ton of clarity heading into the weekend with these guys. So there you have it, folks. That is my top 36 wide receivers as we head into week 5 of the NFL season. As always, if you found something today entertaining, actionable, informative, do me a favor and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to this channel. That way you don't miss any of the updates that come out over the rest of the week. That way, when we get some more of this injury news, we can give you some better information as we get it. And last but not least, make sure you go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description. But with all of that being said, nothing else for you guys today. I will see you on our next episode. But until then, peace out.